Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 7th chapter in the book of Matthew. This is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson. We made it all the way up to the first 14 verses. We're going to take this one from 15 all the way to 29, thus completing and concluding the Sermon of the Mount, which is, as I've explained in these predecessors, the longest single recorded sermon. Everything from 5:3 to 7:27, we're going to take this to 5:29, is underlined in red. This is a sermon delivered on the Mount early in his ministry. He had only recently been baptized, and then he was tempted by Satan 4 days later. Then he called the fishermen and called them to be fishers of men. Then he tracks a substantial crowd at an unidentified mountain. We know it was a hill or a mountain somewhere, but this is where he preached it, and the people gathered around him because they had never heard anything like it, and as they conclude, they notice that he teaches with authority. So this new man, this itinerant preacher, was giving this new doctrine, and it was unlike anything they had ever heard. And the 7th chapter opens much in the same manner as the 6th, with a warning and an indictment of hypocrisy, and the specific sin this targets is judgmentalism. Judgmentalism is a sin of the spirit, and what it does is it compels the hypocrite, the sinner, to be a religious detective, and what this does is blind them to their own sin. And eventually he makes that point through the analogy of the splinter and the plank. So the person who's judging is blind to their own defect, which is glaring and obvious to all, but they are so focused on the minutia of others. So the first two verses read, "Do not judge, lest you be judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with the same measure you use, it shall be measured to you." The rewards of judgment is the invitation of the retaliation that you willingly inflict on others. So the rewards of judgment, the life of judgment, does not pay, because we all must be judged. And if we spend every waking second on this earth judging others, then we're going to be judged where it matters most. And it's just the principle that if you are kind to people, people will be kind to you. If you judge others, they're going to judge you. This connects to the golden rule, verse 12. But the next three verses kind of explain that analogy, the metaphor that I did of the sinner being blinded by his own defect and yet oblivious to his own defect, and then seeing the minutia in the other sinner, the tiny defect. But what this does is introduces metaphorical knowledge, metaphorical language. Most of the Sermon of the Mount prior to this point speaks in explicit, plain, direct language, but this bleeds into the 6th verse, and it ultimately concludes with the parable and the material we're going to cover today. 6th verse, do not give what is sacred to the dogs, nor throw your pearls before the pigs, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you into pieces. So the metaphor of the foundation of the pigs is a pig and a dog are unworthy. These are filthy animals. Dogs are affectionate and beloved in America, but the Jews considered them unclean, and a pig was the worst of the worst. So we have to judge the worthiness and the receptibility of the evangelical target. We should not be distributing our spiritual gems, which are far too precious, to waste on the pigs, who are analogous to spiritually filthy people. So use discernment and discretion and judgment. So judgmentalism is a sin. Judging is not. So judging is something we are called to do. We have to enforce internal discipline in our church. We have to judge the content of the teacher. This is where our lesson that we're going to take it off from begins, and also judge them by their fruits. We'll get there when we get there. Verse 7, ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it shall be opened. This ought not be interpreted as an endorsement of the blank check prayer where you can pray any selfish desire. It is asking the right prayer. No righteous request will he undeny. And you can ask for your own little projects, but there's 3 answers you might give: yes, no, and not yet. But the important thing is that it's the asking and the knocking is not a one-time asking. What a one-time knocking, it's a seeking. So we have to continually ask the same questions in order to expect an answer to prayer. This is nothing automatic. It would cheapen the practice of prayer if we were able to do it a one-and-done finality. But if you seek, you will find. You do have to seek, so the seeking is logically prior and necessary for the finding, essential and imperative for it, but if you knock loud enough, often enough, and frequently and fervently enough, then the door to his ear will be unlocked. And he just gives the analogy of a father giving gifts to his son. If you, being wicked, are able to give good gifts, how much more is your Father, who is good beyond good, the source of all goodness, know how to give to those who ask him? And in Matthew 6:8, we read that he knows our desires before we can even articulate them. Verse 12, this is the golden rule. Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the Torah and the prophets. This is the golden rule of Christianity, rabbinical Judaism, Buddhism, Hindu, and Greco-Roman philosophy. Rabbinical Judaism stress the negative principles. Do not do unto others what you would not do unto them. But the positive approach is what is the key, which makes the difference, because how much more challenging it is to be the one to do something positive than to simply refrain from harming people. Treat others as they were yourself. This is the summation, this is the summary of the law and the prophets. This is the authority with which he speaks. Enter in through the narrow gate, because the gate is wide and the way is broad. That leads to destructions, and there are many who enter through it. Because the gate is narrow and the way is hard pressed, which leads to life, there are few who find it. Only a remnant shall be saved. Salvation. Death is a democracy. Salvation is an aristocracy. The way is narrow and straight, and it is found in his name and in his path. The snares and the temptations which surround us on the broad way can suffocate us if we do not maintain a steadfast adherence and rigorous adherence to the straight and narrow path, because all the ways of the world are literally all around us. The temptation is there, but the gate remains narrow, and that's why so few will find it. And he also, in the range we're going to cover today, he disqualifies all talk, no action Christians from that blessed abode. Verse 15, lesson itself. But beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep clothing, but inwardly they are savage wolves. That word beware we first read in the first verse of the 6th chapter. He says, beware of doing your good deeds in front of men in order to be seen. And a similar danger exists, so he's telling us to beware of the false prophets. They are not what they seem. They have the exterior. They are and of course it's going to be advantageous to the predator to infiltrate the flock in their own clothing, to think that they are one of them. Then they work their subversive agenda. And false prophets, now there is going to be an acceleration of false prophets in the end times, but false prophets are a fact of any age. They were a reality in Judaism, reality in Christianity, and it's only going to get worse the nearer we come to the end times, because many, plural, false prophets, distinct from the singular, the second beast of Revelation 13, the false prophets, are going to arise, and they're not going to be what they're seen. They're going to infiltrate and earn the trust of professed Christians through their store humility and just their exterior piety, but inwardly they are savage wolves. They're here to destroy what God has designed. By their fruits you shall know them. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from tree? Once more, he accelerates the use of metaphorical language. The sheep and the wolf, these aren't literal animals. These are false prophets and humans. And by the fruit, now it's a law of biology that that bad fruit cannot come from a good tree, and good fruit cannot come from a bad tree. So the fruits are the character that they exude, their teaching, their works. By their fruits you will know if what they are teaching is true, if it delivers results in actions. But it's a biological impossibility for one species to give birth to another species, and this completely demolishes Darwinian theory, even though it's taught as fact. A good tree is unable to yield wicked fruit, a rotten tree to yield good fruit. So what is true of good being unable to produce its opposite is equally true of the opposite. The bad is unable to produce its own opposite, because from the parent it determines the quality and character of the son, or the child, the offspring. He's talking about trees here, plants. They do not have children in the same sense that we do, but it's folly to expect the ripe grapes from a tree that is rotten or wicked in this here. So the wicked fruit can't be wicked, but people can. So what's he talking about? He's talking about false prophets and heretics and infiltrators and subverters. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. A tree that does not produce good fruit is useless because it is fruitless. A tree's sole purpose and entire reason for being on the earth is to multiply and replenish its own kind. But if it can't do that, then the only use for the tree, the tree, whoever's property the tree happens to lie on, is to cut it down and toss it into the fire, get rid of it. Don't leave it there because it's a weighty thing. But fire is analogous to hell in this context. This is also, we can connect this to the great vine, the divine vine, I am, in John 15, where every vine which is fruitless is fit only for the fire, 15:2 and 15:6 in that book. So then, by their fruits you shall know them. This, of course, requires and necessitates judgment. We have to judge the teachings, we have to judge the fruits of those who lead us, and we're going to know the quality and the caliber of their character based on their fruits. This is what they exude, this is what they bring, this is what they multiply. Fruit exists to make more of the same. So if you are a blind leading the blind into a ditch, then they're going to tag along and lead other blind people. But conversely, if you are an illuminated, if you are walking in the light, then you can lead others to the light, and the light has an attractive quality that will bring others, and they will recognize it by its fruit. It will be light, it will be true, it will be good. It'll be wholesome, and the way and the method of the false prophet is entirely self-serving. And we have the guidelines in the book of Deuteronomy, the 13th and the 18th chapter, for how to detect false prophets. As I mentioned earlier, false prophets are nothing new. They're a fact of life in Judaism, and they're a fact of life in Christianity, and they're going to be an increasingly potent fact of life as we near the end times. Not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who is doing the will of my Father in the heavens. So lip service, it's one thing to be a professing Christian, but there is a profound difference between a possessing Christian. A possessing Christian possesses the Spirit, he possesses salvation, whereas a professing Christian is all lip service, all talk, no action. They say the right things, and they claim to be saved and claim to belong to him. But the fact is that not everyone who claims they're saved is going to end up saved. But he who does the will and follows the way and obeys the will at all hazard and health and cost is the one who's going to land in heaven. So we have to seek the will, we have to know the will, we have to understand the will, and we have to do the will. We have to learn it, live it. And the Bible observes no distinction or separation between doctrine and duty and revelation and response, nor should we. So once we know the will, the challenge and the difficulty is he's going to ask you to do some things that are difficult to do, and these are necessary for your growth. So you have to suck it up and obey regardless of the consequences and in spite of the circumstances. Many shall say to me in that day, Master, Master, have we not prophesied in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and done mighty works in your name? They're saying the wrong things. These men are at the throne of judgment, and they're pleading their own case for their own salvation. And this is a question we have to at least entertain the answer to, because we may well be asked at the judgment, why should I let you in? And these people have it all wrong. They are resting their salvation on their works. They said, we did all these things for you. You owe us this. We could prophesy. They said the right things, but the prophecy is there. It's a neutral term. There is false prophets and there is real prophets. Exorcisms. This is something that can be done in his power and in his name, but it can also be done apart from him, and any work done apart from him is fruitless and vain and fit only for the fire. And done mighty works in your name. There is such a thing as satanic supernatural. Satan can perform miracles, although there is a dispute as to whether they are authentic miracles or mirages. But false signs and wonders, these are the things that the false prophets are going to deceive, even if possible, the very elect with. They're going to be making miracles and performing miracles, but they're not going to belong to him. And then I shall declare to them, I never knew ye. Depart from me, you who work lawlessness. Workers of iniquity is perhaps the more familiar translation, but iniquity and lawlessness are interchangeable, but not exactly identical. They're synonymous. But he's going to tell them, this is his response to their response. This is what he says in response to what they say. They're pleading their case. They're petitioning him to let him in. They're reminding him of all the things that they did for him. And he's going to tell them, I didn't even know you. Depart from me. You do not belong to me. You thought you did. You said the right name. You did the right things, but your heart was not in it. You were a lip service religion, and legalism is in fact a species of lawlessness and wickedness. The idea that we can use the law to incur a debt is just the height of arrogance and blasphemy. Therefore, everyone who hears those words of mine and does them shall be like a wise man who built the house on the rock. This is the first parable. This is a literary device that is unique to the synoptics. A parable is an instructive illustration which uses familiar events from everyday experience or commonly observed natural phenomenon as analogous illustrations to illuminate new didactic truths in a manner that is more lifelike than is possible by explicit abstract precept or explicit declaration. These add a life element. So the familiar and relatable thing is a building on the house and on the sea. That is something we can envision. That is something we can entertain. He leads now the house on the rock. The rock is obviously a more advantageous foundation for a physical house, and this is the metaphor and the connection. The spiritual connection is obeying the will. To hear the words doesn't mean we hear the words. It means we do the words. Be ye not hearers of the word, but doers. James 1:22 and Romans 2:13. But obedience to the will is likened to a man who builds his house and by consequence his eternal home, the attendant corollary, his salvation in a house of rock. He is our rock. He is our solid foundation. He is immutable. He is strong. He is, and we are wise to rest our salvation and our trust in him. And when the storm comes, which is analogous to the divine judgment, guess which one's going to stand? The one we just read. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. The physical foundation of a home or a building determines the quality of its caliber and its endurance and its ability to withstand the elements. So if you have a home that is built in the solid foundation of a rock, it's going to be able to withstand the storm and the natural elements. Homes exist to provide shelter from natural elements. So if the shelter cannot protect itself from the elements, then it's of no use. But the one that is built on the rock, in the rock, is going to last when all these things come. Flood is rain, and the flood. This invokes images of judgment from Genesis, Noah's stories, Genesis 6 through 10. And winds and storms there are precedents throughout the Bible of divine judgment. The wind which blew on Job's children, the structure they were in, a horrible east wind blew, and it fell on them. But even though their house was sturdily built, but that's another story. The important thing here is follow the positive example, because what happens after is going to be a negative one. Now, as far as parables are concerned, this one is pretty self-explanatory as they progress. The parables take off in the 13th chapter of Matthew. There are 7 of them there. And parables are unique to the synoptic accounts. John doesn't record any of them. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them shall be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. 2 ears and 2 minds can read the same message, and one will do it and one will not do it. One will treat it with indolence and indifference. The other will take it seriously, and they will make the necessary preparations to live in accordance to the word that they hear and know and understand. But if you're going to be building it on the sand, that is foolish, because remember, the physical structure's foundation determines the strength of the plenary structure in its entire whole. So if you're going to be building it in the sand, that is a flimsy foundation, and when all these things come, which didn't knock down the house that is built on the rock. It's going to knock down the things on the sand. Moral of the story, take seriously his will. Don't resist it. Don't question it. You can question it. It's not sinful to have doubts. Your doubts can solidify your faith. But he doesn't owe us an explanation at any point. And, don't be your own master. Don't be your own God, because if that is building a very flimsy foundation, because we cannot save ourselves. God can do that uniquely and only. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. All of this could have been prevented. This was a preventable disaster, but because the home builder, the homeowner, elected to build it on the flimsy foundation of the sand, all these things came, and the home was no longer able to provide protection from the elements to the home dweller, because it was itself unprotected by the home builder. So it was not designed to withstand the storms and the physical commotions of nature. This is why we have shelter. This is why homes are necessary and vital for our survival, because we'd be at the mercy of the elements, the rain, the floods, the winds, et al., etc. But if our house, which exists to protect us from such calamities, cannot stand, then we ourselves are unprotected, and we would be foolish to waste all that time, effort, and energy on building the same house that could have been built in a firmer foundation, because it's all for naught. It's all a house of cards. It's all going to come tumbling down. So what does this mean to us? We have to obey the word and make the necessary preparations in light of the revelation that we receive. This concludes the portion that is underlined in red. This concludes the sermon. Now we read a brief 2 verses about the audience's reaction. So he had just preached the longest recorded sermon. Luke presents his version, but he has it scattered in his account, I think through the 6th and the 11th and the 12th chapters. But much of the material we're reading here, Luke does have a parallel version. Matthew has it all condensed, and so he presents it as a single sermon. And it came to be, when Yahshua had ended these words, that the people were astonished at his teachings. They never heard anything like it. He is always astonishing. He is seldom astonished. That word appears 3 times, or amazed in other translation. 3 times he's amazed in this book, in the 8th chapter, at the centurion's faith. The Roman centurion's faith, which exceeded the faith of anyone in Israel. And Luke records the same version a different version of the same story in the 7th chapter in the book which bears his name. And also in Mark, he is amazed by their lack of faith. So the 2 things which excite his stimulation for amazement are his faith or lack thereof. But these people, they are on an inferior level than he is, spiritually, humanly, everything else. But they had never heard anything like it, and astonishment was the anticipated reaction, because this is some radical stuff, yet it is not a deviation or a departure from the laws of Moses. He did not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. He spoke, 29th verse and final one, for he was teaching them as one possessing authority, and not as the scribes. The scribes quoted from authority. They could reference authority, and the Messiah does reference some Old Testament scriptures in the, you heard that it was said in the 5th chapter. But his authority was sufficient in himself. His authority was not derivative from the scholarly schools. He was not formally educated. And as a rabbi, nevertheless, he was one, and people liked what he had to say. Other rabbis, they had synagogues. This guy had an entire mountain of people following to him. And the difference was that he had authority. He didn't quote it. He spoke with it. And the authority is connected to his sovereign omnipotence. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.